Hey everyone, this is Dr. Kelly Brennan for COM 111 Public Speaking. Today we're going to be talking on listening. Huh? Just kidding. When you think about listening, how do you determine what to listen to? I mean, think about it. We have so many things that are coming at us. How do we know what's important to listen to and what's not? And the answer is right here. All, not some, but all listening is driven by motives and needs. Motives are wants. So a lot of our listening is driven by our wants and our needs. So what are your motives and what are your needs? And all of us have a hierarchy of, here's my most important want or need to my least. And depending on all the stimuli out there to listen to, we might fixate on this and not fixate on others. So, it is our motives and our needs that determine what we listen to and what we don't. For example, I have 9 kids. You can imagine when I come home how much noise there is and how sometimes I have a lot of children vying for my attention. But as soon as my wife speaks, that's what I focus in on. Because there are needs and wants there. I love my wife. I need my wife. She comes first. Love my kids. But they will come in a different order, depending on the needs and, of course, the wants. All of us do this. So, do you think we have the responsibility to listen all the time? I mean, think about it. Have you ever listened to someone with your undivided attention for any great length of time? And if you have, by the time you're done, you are mentally drained. It's interesting, sometimes when we have speeches, like in one of my night classes, I'll listen to 20 speeches in a row. And then we might get out maybe a few minutes early, and some students are like, well, why are we getting out early? They might be okay because they only had to focus for about 5 or 6 minutes on their speech. But me, I've had to focus on every single speech for 5 to 6 minutes 20 times with my undivided attention because I'm grading. And by the time the last speech is done, my mind is spent. And if you've ever had the opportunity to be engaged in a conversation with someone who might be pouring their heart out to you, or you might be discussing something really important, if you've talked for any good length of time and you've really listened well, it can be very energy draining for you. So, it's interesting, many people have never learned to listen. In fact, they don't realize that sometimes listening takes a lot of time and concentration. I mean, think about it. In the learning to communicate, in that process, the approach has always been focused on how to speak. Rarely on how to listen. Think about it. How many of you who are watching this have ever taken a listening class? Or how many of you have ever had someone say, okay, everyone, we're going to learn how to listen today. We assume, because we have a hole on each side of our heads that are surrounded by what we call the pinna, or the cartilage known as the ears, we assume that everyone's a great listener, but it's not true. Yes, there are some people who are really good at listening. And there are people who are really horrible, and a lot of people in between. What makes one a great listener is because they've learned that it takes time and concentration and effort. And for those who aren't so good, they haven't put the time in. Here's what's interesting. When you think about listening, like I said, effective listening begins with listening, not speaking. Think of the listener carrying 80%, up to 80% of the responsibility of effective communication. Look, I can speak for hours on end, as you can probably tell, in this video. But if you're really not listening, how effective is what I'm saying? I'm only as effective as you are in listening to what I have to say. So here's what we find out about college students. You spend more than 53% of your time listening. And of everything that you've really paid attention to and really listened to that day in the form of lectures or anything else, you forget half of everything you've heard in that day as soon as the day's over. And in a couple days later, you forget half of the half that you walked away with. And we call that the residual message. The residual message is where we only recall about 25% of whatever it is the speaker says. So what's the whole process of listening? Well, the physiological part of listening is with our ears, our eyes, and our body. Think about listening with our ears, right? Just do me this favor, and maybe no one else is around. Take your hands, put them behind your ears, bring your ears forward, and just start talking or making noise. Go ahead. Really is amplified, right? Now take your hands and put them in front of your ears and do the same thing. Go ahead. Really sounds a little muffled, right? Now take your hands away from your head and do the same thing. Go ahead. Sounds normal, right? See, the ears grow to the size and the circumference of our head and our genetic makeup. And they grow out like little antennas so that they can catch the airwaves. So if I go like this, it creates sound waves. Those sound waves go through, and because the ear is out like this, the sound wave hits the pinna, siphons the sound waves down the ear canal, stimulates the eardrum and the three small bones that goes to the audio nerve to the brain that says, "What was that?" "Oh, it was my geeky professor clapping his hands together." Ever been laying in your bed late at night, and in the still of the night you hear a noise, and you're like, "What was that?" And you go through the files in your brain and go, "Oh, that sounds like," and you put a familiar sound to it so that you can help identify it. You know, what's interesting is way back in, all the way up until about the 1980s, when children's ears maybe might have been a little bit too big. I mean, we all know that when we're growing up, everything in our body doesn't grow proportionately the same. Sometimes our feet are really big, but then we grow into them. Our hands are really big, but we grow into them. I had a friend one time whose ears were huge, and he got the nickname Dumbo. And because I lived in the city of Chicago and is known as the Windy City, some of the other classmates would say, "Okay, don't go outside, Mike, because the wind might get those ears flapping and it's going to take you away," like Dumbo. In the beginning of the year, Mike was very verbose and talkative. I noticed halfway through the year, at lunch, he'd be kind of quiet, kept to himself. And then towards the spring, he was all talkative again. And I said, "Hey, how you doing?" He goes, "Hey, don't you notice?" "What?" He goes, "I got my ears pinned back." Back in the day, if your ears stuck out too much, and if your parents started to notice that you spent way too much time in your room, or you were kept to yourself, if they said something to your doctors, the doctors back in the day used to be able to pin back the ears. They call it tap back. Not all, but some of the children who got these tap backs, some of the parents started to notice that when their child was trying to listen to the parent talk to them, or when the child was listening to what was on the television, that the child was now starting to turn their head or one of their ears towards the sound. And the parents thought, "Oh my gosh, they've ruined my child's hearing." So the American Medical Association went, because there was all these lawsuits by parents claiming that their children's ears were damaged, so they went and they tested all these children only to find out they were all fine. But the problem is, because they pinned their ears back, It was much like when you went like this. The sounds were now missing the ears. So they offer to all children to have that process reversed. And most did, and they banned any tackbacks after that. We listen with our eyes. Ever have somebody say to you, look at me when I'm talking to you? We always say the eyes are the windows of the soul. When we communicate, we want someone to look at us. That gives us the indication of listening. Same with the body. If you're coming towards me and I do this, and you're talking at me and I'm like, or I'm doing this, it might give the indication that I'm either not interested or I don't care. But if you come to me and my arms are somewhat open and I've turned towards you and I'm leaning a little bit, gives you the indication that I'm open to listening to your message. We listen with our minds. In psychology, we call this being mindful, being present in the moment, being connected, being there, not daydreaming and being somewhere else. We listen with our hearts. We call it empathetic listening, which, by the way, is easier said than done. A lot of people think, oh, I can see where they're coming from. I can put myself in their shoes. Not really, because if we could, we would understand each other more. But listening with the heart is the emotional connection. Ever listen to someone and they said something to you that's pierced your heart and caused a tear? Or they've got you fired up? Next is environmental listening. This is where you might listen with your environment. I don't know about you, but anytime that someone wanted to talk to me, they always wanted to make sure that a certain location so that the environment also was conducive to what we were talking about. Last but not least is listening with our soul. Being so connected and in tune with the person that you feel like they're just talking to you. In either event, we listen through a variety of ways, physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually, that connects us to the speakers. And that's why I always tell my students, when you come to class, you need to be prepared to listen. If effective listening is on the, this is the responsibility of the audience, you have to come prepared to listen to speeches. So, I asked, were you ever taught? Or how were you taught to listen? Here's the thing. The very first thing that a child learns is to listen. They use it about 45% of the time. Never been taught how to do it. Think about it. With all my kids, when they were little, I'd be like, oh, hi, hon, daddy loves you. Or their mother would talk to the child. The child just looks and they watch. And then eventually they start to mimic. And the neurons are connected in the brains. And they're acquiring language. And then one day they say, mommy or daddy. And we light up. Oh my gosh, did you hear that? Because the second thing that a child learns to do is to speak. Use it about 30% of the time. The next least thing taught. If you add 45 plus 30, it equals 75. 75% of the communication process you're hardly ever taught or never taught. Well, no wonder communication's so hard. The third thing we tend to learn is to read. Use it about 16% of the time. The next most thing we're taught. Think about all the chapters we have you read in college or in academia in general. And the last thing you learn is to write. Use it about 9% of our time. The most thing we're taught. In learning our ABCs, learning how to write words, sentences, paragraphs, pages, papers. We do it all the time. Even text messages, Twitter, everything. So it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it, that receiving the message is a vital component in the process of communication. So listening is a skill that enables us to receive the message. So, What is listening? How can you tell if someone's listening? How can you tell when they're not? How does it make you feel when you know someone's listening? And how does it make you feel when you know they're not? So when you think about listening, it's a 5-step or stage process. The very first thing we do is hearing. So the very first step or stage in listening is hearing. Everyone hears. If you were in a room like this, you couldn't help but hear me clapping. Now people out in the hall or in the next room or outside the campus didn't hear that. But if you're within the vicinity of the sound, you hear it because you have these things called ears. Now that's what we call the physiological aspect of listening, because you can't help but hear because you were within the same vicinity of the sound. Now, once you've heard it, you decide whether or not you're going to pay attention to it. This is where your motives and your needs emerge. And you start to have a filtering out process. I'm going to focus on something that's going to give me my needs and my wants and filter out the rest. So this attending is what we call the psychological aspect. This is where most individuals drop the ball. But if they're paying attention, they'll focus on what the most important sound is. Third, so after we've heard it, we pay attention to it. The third thing we try to do is to understand it. And that understanding usually comes intellectually based upon the rules of our language. So if someone's following the rules of our language, it makes sense. We understand it. We look to the knowledge of the source. If somebody that we know really well says a pretty flippant comment, we're like, ha ha ha, they're being funny. If we don't know them very well, we're like, wow, that same comment might come across as rude. So the knowledge of the source is key. Context of the message. If I'm teaching an 8 o'clock in the morning public speaking class, and they're yawning, it's because it's 8 o'clock in the morning. They might have just woke up. Or if I'm teaching a communications class at night, and they're yawning, it's because it's getting late. But if you're yawning and it's in the middle of the day, it's not because it's too early or too late, it's because I'm boring. So we look to the context of the message to give us greater understanding. And last but not least, understanding also is very dependent on the listener's mental ability, or better known as their intelligence. If I'm talking to adults, there's an expectation that I have of them to understand my message. If I'm talking to a bunch of 4-year-olds, the expectation is different. And I will not have the same expectation of 4-year-olds as I will with adults. The fourth thing we do, so we've heard it, we pay attention to it, we try to understand it, now we're trying to remember. Now, this is hard because we have two memory storage places, short-term, long-term. Most of everything we hear stays in short-term and we keep it long enough to be able to use the information and then it's gone. But there are some times where we need to transfer that information to our long-term memory because we need to be able to use it and apply it always or maybe later. So some ways to transfer short-term information to long-term is the number of times we've heard it, the number of times we've heard it, the number of times we've heard it. That's why in commercials, the jingles or the catch-all phrase is repeated a number of times because through repetition, we recall. It's the number of times you've heard it. The amount of information to be stored. I have students who want to memorize a speech, right? There are basically 26 lines to a typed page. There's no way you can memorize 26 lines, but there's a process called chunking, where we take 4 to no more than 5 sentences and put that in one chunk or a block. Label that 1. Then do the same with another 4 or 5 sentences. That's block 2, and so on. You memorize block 1. Memorize block 2. Repeat block 1 and 2. Memorize block 3. Repeat block 1, 2, 3. Memorize block 4. And if you do that, memorizing, putting things into long-term memory for greater recall is what can help us to develop a more photographic memory. And by the way, anyone can develop a photographic memory. It's like, you think Arnold Schwarzenegger was born the way he was? And if you've ever seen his photos of being a young boy, he was a really skinny guy. But he worked every day. And pretty soon he became Mr. Universe 6 times. You can become the Arnold Schwarzenegger of memorization and getting a photographic memory if you memorize something every day. And studies have shown that if you do this for about a year, you'll develop a more photographic memory, or at least an easier way to recall or remember information. The ability to be able to rehearse it or not. That's why we tell students, go out and practice your speech, because the more you tend to rehearse, the higher the recall or the remembrance will be. Last but not least, the last step or stage of listening is called responding. We respond in any one of the following 3 ways: passive, active, directive. Remember the word PAD. It's an acronym: passive, active, directive. You should always start with passively listening. So when you listen passively, you're paying attention and non-verbally responding without offering any verbal communication. You're just going, and you're allowing the other person to be able to just talk. Then eventually you'll be able to, and you will need to, move to active listening, where you might want to draw out more ideas and thoughts and feelings by asking questions or paraphrasing, and yes, being empathetic in your listening. And then at somewhere in this point, you're going to have to decide, do I want to tell them what I think? Do I want to tell them what they should do? If you think that's what they want, then it's called directive listening. Telling others what to do regardless of how it may or may not affect or impact them. Not everyone wants to know what you think. Not everyone wants to know what you think they should do. Sometimes they just want you to listen. And yeah, you can draw out more ideas with active listening, but then you just maybe need to leave it there. But only you will know at that time. So here are the 5 different ways that we listen: discriminative, comprehensive, appreciative, empathetic, and critical. Discriminative is listening with prejudice. I don't think any one of us wants to go to a courtroom and have a judge or a jury prejudice against us. But a lot of times we do listen in a very discriminatory way, because we will be filtering things out as we're listening. That's not necessarily the best thing to do. Comprehensive is trying to listen for the whole big picture. Nothing wrong with trying to get the whole big picture, but sometimes you can lose even the small parts. Appreciative listening is what you do. It's basically what you listen to when you don't have to. Like, I love music. So when I'm driving, my tunes have to be on. Or maybe somebody who loves to listen to an audiobook. Or maybe they love to talk to their friends over Bluetooth in the car. It's whatever you're listening to when you don't have to, because you appreciate it. Empathetic listening is putting yourself in their shoes. So if I'm talking to someone and they're having a relational problem, I might be passively listening as they tell me what's wrong. I might actively say, well, what else did you feel? What happened when that happened? And then maybe there might come a point where I think, well, here's what I would do if I were you. That's me trying to put myself in their shoes. The last but not least is what we call critical listening. This might be used when you're listening to a politician give her or his speech, listening at first passively, letting them tell you what they want to tell you. Once you've gotten the message, then you filter their message through your moral compass of your beliefs, values, and attitudes, and that's critical listening. And then deciphering at the end whether or not you agree or disagree with the candidate. So what causes some people to have poor listening habits? Here are several. First one is pseudo-listening. Ever talk to somebody and as you're talking to them, they're going, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or as you're talking, you can tell that they get that glazed over look in their eyes. And then all of a sudden they come back later and they blink. And you're like, oh, welcome back. That's because they're faking. That's called pseudo-listening. Another one is stage hogging. Ever try to talk to somebody and every time you're going to say something, they interrupt you because they want to talk about something more important than what you want to have? That's an interrupter or a stage hog. Selective listening, responding to only certain parts of the message. Maybe you're in a relationship and money's an issue. Or maybe a past relationship. So you're only going to respond to certain parts of a message because you're selecting what you're going to respond to and what you won't. Filling in the gaps. This is listening long enough to get to the point where you're going to fast forward because you think you know where they're going. Oh, I know where this is going. And you fill in the gaps, you jump in, and you may be right, and you might be wrong. Number 5, insulated listening. Ooh, these are avoiding topics. This is usually done with politics. Ooh, I'm not going to listen to the other side of the aisle. Religion. No, they're wrong. Or maybe in relationships, maybe money's an issue. So anytime bills get brought up or money gets brought up, you do a topic shift and try to talk about something else because you're trying to insulate yourself from that. Defensive listening. When we go into a conversation, like when I talk to my teenagers, when I say, hey, I want to talk to you about the chores, they're all geared up. Well, I'm gonna go into this ready to fight. And they might take one of my very innocent comments as a personal attack. Ambushing. This is an interesting one. This is where you might be in a conversation with someone and maybe there's something that they said that you haven't responded to, but you're not ready to. So you're going to put that in your gunny sack and carry it around for a while so that in another conversation you're going to reach in there and ambush them with it later. That's not always very healthy to do. So what are some of the types of distractions that we have? Ever been sick? You might have a cold, your head, you might have your ears clogged. Anytime you have any of your senses that are impaired, that's called physical distractions. Physiological, again, you're ill, taking too much caffeine. Psychological, it's got bad attitude. Factual, I'm just looking for the facts. Semantic, somebody might say a word and go, I don't like the way that sounded. Have you ever talked to somebody and you said something and they go, I don't like the way that sounded. Now you're not defending what it is you said, you're defending the way it sounded. That's semantic. So how can we get better at listening? Practice. And as cheesy as it's going to sound, you have to want to be a better speaker. And it won't happen overnight. It'll take quite a while. But pretty soon, as you're working at it, pretty soon it will, something that seems to be a lot of work is now going to become more second nature. So you got to start with a desire and a want to listen better. Focus on the message. Listen passively. Let them speak. Listen for main ideas. Don't try to get every little thing. Try to understand the speaker's point of view. Again, this is going to empathetic listening, which a lot of people think they do really well, but they don't. reinforce the message with your own personal prior knowledge. Provide feedback. At first it might be nonverbal. Uh-huh. Oh, uh-huh. And then verbally. Well, how did you feel after that happened to you? Listen with the body. Not like this, but more like this. Withhold judgment. You cannot get to the truth of things if you already made the judgment. If I've already have condemned someone, why listen to them? You don't want to judge or a jury to listen to the evidence of your case that they've already made up their mind. You want them to be empathetic, put themselves in your shoes, be open-minded, listen critically. And that is when you listen without prejudice or judgment. After you receive the message, then you filter that message through your moral compass of beliefs, values, and attitudes, and that will give you a more accurate understanding of the message. All right, that's all we have for today. As you can see, next time, we're going to talk about informative speaking. Have a great day.